So maybe we should go ahead and get started. I'm so glad to see so many people here from all over. This is awesome. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte. A couple of logistical things before you get started. First is there is closed captioning available for those who need it. There's the closed caption link at the bottom. Secondly, I want to advertise a little bit about this series in which this talk of the series of which this talk is a part. It's about models for equitable minority inclusion in institutional research. And after today's talk with Omega Wilson, we have three more. On February 17th, Pepijn of the University of Western Ontario will talk about the value of communities and their consent. On March 8th, it's a Monday, Nikita Shiel-Rolle, who's of the Cat Island Conservation Institute in the Bahamas, will speak on Beyond the Walls of the Ivory Tower, Perspectives on Equitable Community-Based Research. And finally, March 22nd, another Monday, Max Liboiron, of the director of the Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research at Memorial University in Newfoundland, will talk about colonialism and citizen science. Those talks are all announced with the registration links on the center's webpage, which is ethics.uncc.edu. And we'd love to see all of you there for those as well. Previous talks, including this one, will also be archived on the center's YouTube channel. There's a link to that up on the upper right-hand corner of the webpage that I just mentioned to you. So today's speaker is Omega Wilson, who's the co-founder of the West End Revitalization Association in Mebane, North Carolina, which is a community situated about halfway between Greensboro and Durham. He founded this in 1994, and rather than take up all his time listing what they've done, I'll just highlight a couple of accomplishments. The first thing is they've taken on the regulatory state and they won. So Omega led actions under the Clean Water Act and brought first-time sewer service to over 100 folks in the community. Secondly, the topic of the talk today, the community-owned and managed research, or COMR model, has been picked up by the EPA and featured as one of their case studies. So this is a model that's gotten national attention and praise. Omega's got a talk for us, after which my colleague Angel Harding will be joining us to help moderate a Q&A session after the talk. So Angel's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Geography and Earth Sciences Department here at UNC Charlotte. She gave a talk as part of this series back in the fall, which, yes, will be up on YouTube as soon as I can get myself together to do that. But we have the video and the audio, so it's coming. She also works with Nikita Shiel-Rolle, who will be talking in a few weeks. So at this point, I think the best thing for me to do is to be quiet and let the more interesting folks have a talk. So Omega.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much. The name of our presentation today is, our talk today is, we call it COMR for short, Community Owned and Managed Research Model equals right to basic amenities, right to basic public health amenities as it has been expanded. If you look at the slide screen, you'll be able to see at the bottom of the screen our email address, if there's something you want to email to us directly. And just to the right of it is our original website. And there's some research on there that we did when we first started this relationship with the university that we'd already done. And there are maps on there, and there are a lot of photographs on there, and community people working with us. And this website was put up originally in 2000, 22 years ago, in order to demonstrate to EPA officials that we did exist, because the local government, when they were contacted about what was going on, we just kind of disappeared in their language and their communication. And when the EPA contacted us back, we had to come up with a way of telling them, oh yeah, we are out here. We've been out here for a long time. Okay, next slide. Uh, okay. Of course, as Gordon has said, we started organizing in 1984, and we became incorporated as a 501c3 in 1995. There were 4 or 5 couples meeting on a regular basis just to celebrate the fact that my wife and I moved back here after being in Bowling Green, Ohio, Jackson State, Mississippi, and Philadelphia, and celebrating anniversaries and parties and birthdays, et cetera. So this issue always came up about what was going on in our community because it looked so much more depressed than it did when I was growing up as a child. But my eyes were deceiving me because it was that way when I was a child. But anyhow, the mission statement we organized a year later was basic amenities, basic public health amenities, which dealt with the whole question of safe water and sewer, streets, sidewalks, stormwater management for people of color. And of course, the community that I live in, this is where people were quote unquote freed uh, uh, in 1865 as slaves, and we're still here. Of course, the indigenous people were here all along, and also dealt with the question of planning and zoning. What motivated the community to do more than it had been doing all of these suffering years was the Department of Transportation published in a newspaper a whole full spread about a highway that was going to be built through Mebane, and it did not identify us or uh, contact us. And it was a $1 billion highway corridor, 27 miles to Danville, Virginia. So we responded to that, and later on we filed a complaint to try to just get involved in it. And we found out it affected not only safe drinking water, clean water, as Gordon has said, clean air, the transportation corridor, conservation and recovery act, and a whole list of other issues that we found out later on. Next slide. One of the iconic things that was a painful thing is that the environmental impact statements that the Department of Transportation produced did not address us. It left us out, even though hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayers' money were paid to contractors to actually come in and see what the environmental impacts were for building a major highway corridor through communities, two specifically, West End, where I live, and White Level, that would destroy churches, cemeteries, etc. And one of the areas that was targeted to be eliminated was a church that my ancestors helped build. And that picture on to the right is St. Luke Christian Church. That's the second generation of the church. That frame was put up in 1931 or so, but some of our ancestors have built it. And as we see on the picture there in 1893, after slavery, and it had been standing there uh, in a second generation since that time. Even though it was within walking distance of a sewage treatment plant that was built, a formal sewage treatment plant was built in 1921, residents were never allowed to tap onto it. We were put in the areas where the trash pile was put. There was no landfills at the time out of slavery. The sewage pit was put, and African Americans, free slaves, were put. When we told the story so many times throughout the country, we found out that this was a historic pattern throughout the Southeast and slave territories. It was systemic. You know, we realized what was happening to us had happened to other people. When we started doing water tests, we found out that there were fecal coliform and in fecal matter in the drinking water and fecal matter in the stream water. Next slide. What some of the areas that were going to be destroyed, we didn't understand that the city was planning because they didn't have public meetings about this. The city and the county officials were basically planning to move to a new generation of industrialization out of old cotton mills and sawmills, and the labor force for that were in these communities, and their cemeteries were in these communities. So they asked the Department of Transportation secretly to physically eliminate our houses and our churches and our cemeteries, which was at first just kind of unbelievable because we knew a lot of these people very personally. So it was like, what is going on? One of the churches, this is a second church, was the Mebane First Presbyterian Church, the Cornerstone, 1865. It was founded by free slaves also. Immediately after slavery, the church members who founded this were family members, mixed race family members of the Scott family that produced two governors, W. Kerr Scott and Robert Scott, and a senator, Senator Ralph Scott. And the cemetery where people have been buried were buried, where slaves have been buried, is still being used now. This is where they buried slaves. All of that was going to be bulldozed up. And of course, the question that our friend Dean Valerie Johnson and the elder Donald Tate, who was visiting the cemetery and that particular church, that's a third generation of that church, is not the original small frame church. We're saying, how in the world do they miss this historic value? And why in the world would the city want to get rid of something that could attract a tremendous amount of positive attention? But that has to do with the whole question of race. My family, by the way, my grandfather's family came from the Scott plantation as slaves, right? So I knew the Scotts, been knowing the Scotts all of my life, right? So this was like, what in the world is going on here, right? Next slide. The timeline of how we developed the community-owned and managed research model had to do with, a lot of things. Of course, just going back to what the slides we just showed, slavery, the disparities that are always there, have always been available, have always been apparent, right? With safe drinking, with the human waste in drinking water. It's supposed to be drinking water, right? Not drinking waster. Drinking water and surface water. And also, what we decided to do with something that was a common way of life is organize a group as a 501c3 and raise money to try to address it, because when we talk to the city officials, county officials, and state officials, we just basically ignored and pushed aside. Part of it had to do with just imperial science, how you monitor and how you train community monitors to observe what's going on. So first they had to train us as a formal organization. The residents who had been there always, they knew what was going on and they had been just living with it as a way of life. So the process was to do interviews, to find out information we could write down, to do formal written surveys, to take photographs of what they already knew. And they showed us things that were just a corner away or a street away or a lot away that had already been there, that wasn't just visible driving down the street. And those were in the West End community, white level communities, as significantly part indigenous still living there, East End community in the city, in Alamance County, and Buckhorn, Perry Hill, Cheeks Cross, which is in Orange County. Mebane is in two counties, right? ETJ, I hope a lot of people can look up what ETJ means, is detailed. It has to do with the property that people control outside the city limits up to a certain period, up to a certain distance. Very much like it's a feudal structure that came out of England and still exists in North Carolina and seven other southern states. We got funding when we started this process, general operating funds from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. And then later on, we got a small grant from EPA, $15,000 to do water samples. And we'd already started the process. We'd already filed a complaint with the Department of Justice. They just want to verify that what we were saying, what we already knew was true and real. Then when the results were positive, we got another grant from EPA. It was $100,000 to go over a 3-year period, where they brought federal officials right on the ground to talk to city officials, county officials, state officials. And that included David Moreau. David Moreau used to be the manager, the chairperson of the North Carolina. He used to be the manager of the North Carolina Environmental Commission for the whole state of North Carolina. He actually came here. We had lawyers here from Washington, D.C., people from New York, Washington, D.C., wanted to actually see the officials and actually talk to them about what was going on. And in those meetings, they still denied right in front of these officials what was clear and in plain sight. This has to do with historic racism pattern. But in any case, in 2000, between 2000 and 2007, the drinking water samples tested at the request of EPA because they wanted them to test it at the closest lab that fit the standards of EPA. Every lab doesn't fit the standard. At that time, they identified 25 state colleges in the United States that could do the test at the standards of the federal government. So conveniently, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill was right down the road, right? So you can see our website uh, and uh, and actually see some of this information by accessing the link there that we shared earlier. Some of the test results and some of the detailed information that we did with some of the students that work with us. Some of those students who work with us at Carolina are now Associate Professor Dr. Jacoby Wilson, board member of the Citizen Science Association at the University of Maryland, Dr. Associate Professor Dr. Chris Haney at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. John Cooper. He specialized in regional and city planning. He's assistant vice president now at Texas A&M, right? They were all students then, and they still use the information that they worked with us as students 23 years ago, as a part of their teaching process at their respective university. All right, next slide. In 2000, when we were working with the university, with these students, with their professors, they were pushing us to use a community-based participatory research model that we thought was insufficient because it didn't deal with the civil rights part of it, which was a violation of rights of people based on their color, right? 1964, Martin Luther King, we all know that story. We're right in it, Black History Month today. When we talked to the Department of Justice, they referred to this issue as a denial of basic amenities due to a historic pattern of racial discrimination, which is the heart of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, right? They said this is a major cause of the denial of access to safe drinking water and sewer connections in the city of Mebane and throughout the South, all right? We concluded very quickly that the participatory model didn't have a new jargon that people are using now, the legal teeth to fight institutional racism, and that the university's approach from the professors' points of view, and I won't name them, was going to be an exploitative process of creating tenure track, writing papers, lectures, possibly books, and traveling with this revealed story, right? And without correcting the problem, because they said that that wasn't not their job. Their job was just to correct quote unquote pure science. Again, we decided to go ahead and formalize what we'd already been doing before we got in contact with the university, was put in contact with the university by EPA. And we were asked, what are you doing? What do you call it? What is the model? So it was after going around the barn a couple of times with a list of terms and names, we decided to name it what it was, community owned and managed research model. And COMR stuck. And it's been recognized and talked about and written about quite a bit now. It was an out of the box term. The 4 basic principles, there are more, but funding equity, when you're working with universities, communities shouldn't get Walmart cards or whatever. There should be management parity. The university should not be in charge of the research data that's collected and make the decisions themselves. And science for compliance is a simple thing that the data is collected, the results is collected, has to be used based on violations or non-compliance with present public health statutes, whether safe drinking water, sewer, toxic exposure, air quality issues, et cetera. And that data should be used, right? That data should be used to produce measurable outcomes based on the non-compliance. And there should be enforcement put in place based on existing federal public health statute. It just made common sense to us that you would collect the data based on violations, you'd solve the problem based on violations of non-compliance. And in this particular case, part of the resistance had to do with the fact that we were pushing against state and local and federal government agencies for violating constitutional law. They felt more comfortable, university officials at Carolina felt more comfortable if we were addressing industry as being the violator of public health laws, not universities, not cities, county, federal government officials, right? Next slide. Well, what happened, there was a moratorium placed after we filed a civil rights complaint in 1999. We started that complaint in 1998. We filed it formally in January of 1999. A moratorium was put on the highway and the overpass construction. We didn't intend that. We just asked to be in the process. Department of Justice determined that it was so egregious. The United States Department of Justice, Washington, D.C., is not the characters we talk about now or last year, different crew of people. But they wanted us, they determined that 6 branches of the federal government were in violation of oversight of civil rights and public health statutes, and they were doing it in a collaborative way. You call it organized crime when you see a show on TV when you have 6 branches of the federal government who are operating in an organized way to evade public health statutes and laws, to deny rights to people of color. And that was exactly what was happening. And he put a moratorium on the project. Modification came as a result of that, right? The highway, we saved dozens of houses, 2 churches, and a community cemetery, the one we showed you in the photograph before. This is called mitigation. That's what the Department of Justice referred to it as. And the civil rights activity in the executive order said that you have to go back and correct some of the things that taxpayers have already paid for. They're talking to the city, they're talking to the county, and they're talking to the state of North Carolina and the Department of Transportation. So block grants were provided, millions of dollars to provide first-time sewer. Some of this is in the cities. People have been paying city taxes for 25, 35 years and didn't have paved streets, sidewalks, and municipal water and sewer, right? These are only Black communities inside the city who are suffering this. We had to remove there were some outhouses still here in the city. First time paved streets that had never been paved in the city, and some just outside of the city. Removed some dead end streets, resurfaced the main street through West End that was in disrepair, even though it was paved. When you got to the Black section of town, as they call it, then they stopped paving the street. So it was like going from a perfect paving to a wagon trail, as one of the residents call it, with potholes and everything. We also stopped a low-income housing development. The city's response was, we're going to redo this and we're going to do it better. And they decided to build a housing development on top of a 9-acre landfill that was in the city, which was also a violation of all of these public health statutes. So it was like, we're gonna make a mistake and we're gonna double down on a mistake and use money to double down on a mistake. So we had to file complaints against that also. And they did build 4 houses. Ironically, the 4 families who moved in them were white residents who moved here from Mebane into Mebane to do what they call starting new home lives. And we tried to tell them what was going on. They didn't believe us. They stayed, and they're still here. 4 houses on top of the landfill. Dozens were supposed to be built. Next slide. Highway corridor. In 2004, we filed an interagency complaint about the non-effective use of the NEPA guideline, National Environmental Protection Act, Environmental Justice Environmental Protection Statement, Environmental Impact Statement. It's supposed to go to the ground and see what this new development is going to do or exacerbate existing harm or add more harm. So we filed this complaint as interagency against the Department of Justice, EPA, and now DEQ as a Superfund site of an old furniture company, 30 acres, that had all kinds of pollution. And they did not address this issue when they did the planning for the highway. So we had to readdress it again. So we filed another complaint. And after the complaint was filed, all of a sudden, the Department of Transportation and EPA and DEQ. That's the same agency that Michael Reagan is leaving, expected to leave to go to Washington, D.C. All of a sudden, they found 5,000 pounds of liquid toxic chemicals and waste from the furniture processing of a furniture plant called Craft Tea that had been there for almost 100 years. And benzenes and xylenes, and the test wells had already been done 20 some years before that identified the chemical contaminants that would leached down in the ground up to the water table, the aquifers 45 feet below ground, but nobody had ever done anything about it. They'd all hid this information, but they built a highway corridor right through it, and they're still building it right through it now. If they had declared this as a Superfund site as we had requested, they would not have been able to build a highway. The church you saw that was torn down, the slide on the right where the water tower is, that's where the church used to be, right? The St. Luke Christian Church. Next slide. This is a little later, a few months later, where the highway corridor is being put up. The overpass is one of the longest dryland overpasses being built in North Carolina, right? It goes over to West Holt Street, which is right outside of my house, our office, over the railroad track, industrial land, and over Highway 70, which used to be the interstate through this part of North Carolina before 85. Going back many decades ago, right? And if you see just to the left of the slide, you see the water tower, and if you look under the bridge overpass, you can see part of the old furniture plant that's still there, right? How do they miss all of this? It had been there forever. Next slide. Some of this information had been shared when I was asked to come to Washington, D.C. to be a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for EPA. Charles Lee, who was one of the people who came when we got the $100,000 grant, was one of the people involved in the civil rights movement and environmental justice movement 40 years ago in Warren County that created the name environmental justice. He was working for the United Church of Christ at the time as a very young man. And he is the senior most environmental justice advisor for the federal government right now at EPA. He was hired because he was the one that collected the data and took all the notes. So he was hired and to develop the Office of Environmental Justice for the federal government, and subsequently offices of environmental justice for all regions of the country and all 50 states and territories outside the United States. He came here, and right outside the building where I'm sitting, he asked me to join the advisory council for the federal government, and I did. And I wrote 2 sections, effective community engagement and community facilitated strategies for this particular document. It is long and detailed. And the title of it is Reducing Air Emissions Associated with Goods Movement, which has to do with highway corridors, airport, marine, inland marine, etc., and what it does to communities that are Black and brown and indigenous. But it was a tough thing because the academicians who were on the work group that I was on did not want us to be recognized in the study. They wanted to hear what we had to say, but the documents that they wanted to reference in the study were the academic papers that they wrote. And those professors, I won't name them by name, but I'll give you some of the universities they came from. If you look at the document, you'll see their names anyhow. Was from the University of Southern California, the University of Oregon in Portland, Washington, University of Washington in Portland. Am I getting the states right? University of Washington, the University of Washington, and the University of Michigan. Those 3 I remember specifically. So in order to get our information included with 4 articles that were co-written by these students I mentioned earlier, Wilson's, Haney, and Dr. Cooper, I had to file a formal complaint against the Office of Environmental Justice and EP and NEJAC with the EPA administrator, who was Lisa Perez Jackson, in order to get our articles included, because some of the professionals and the contractors didn't think we should be formally recognized in this document that I had to travel or work on for over 3 years to get it published. They didn't want the community voice in it. They thought it all only should be academic voices. And the EPA Administrator, Lisa Perez Jackson, who was born and raised in Louisiana, challenged them and told them they must change it. And they included 4 of the articles and the whole section that I wrote. Next slide. These are a list of articles that were related and activities that were related to this work, right? So I won't go through all of them, but one of the biggest things that we did, National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences decided to take a look at what we were doing. And after, that was in 2008 to 2010, they sent an official here by the name of Liam O'Fallon. And most of you, a lot of you know who he is. He still works for NIEHS. He came to Mebane because he wanted to see what we were doing because they'd heard so much about it. And we got a $100,000 grant that was shared between WERA. It was a campus university grant, or campus community grant, as they call it, community campus grant, to evaluate this thing that everybody was talking about for 2 years. And they wanted input from government officials, local community officials, university researchers to see whether it had any merit, this thing called COMR. And they said, okay, it does. The other partner was Dr. Jacoby Wilson, who is doing his postdoc at University of South Carolina. He stayed with it that long. And afterward, they decided to publish it and put it on the website in 2015. It is still there. And they listed us as number 2 out of 250 some community research models that they looked at that had affiliation with National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. During that same period of time, I was invited to present information to the transition team for President Biden and Obama in 2008. And this information, some of this information was posted on the President's website. Again, I was invited to share some of these principles with the Citizen Science Association 2019. And then again, I was asked to share some of this information again with the Bias-Harris administration on November the 30th last year. That was also included in some of the recommendations to address science and how communities are treated regarding this kind of problem-solving structure for EPA as well as Council for Environmental Quality, right? Next slide. Articles, links, all of those links are live. If you click them on, hopefully they're still there. Some of them have been moved around by the previous administration because they're connected to the White House. Next slide. So we'd like to thank you for joining us and having joined the fight for right to basic public health amenities in Mebane, North Carolina, and wherever you might be. Thanks a lot. I appreciate you listening.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Every time I hear you share your story, Omega, I am one part inspired and another part infuriated. And I think that many of us here in this audience that did not live your lived reality, it's still very much a surprise and shock that communities are still experiencing this today. And I think that's why it's really important for us to be able to hear your stories and understand them as best we can as outsiders. And that's where, as those from the university spaces, researchers from nonprofit institutions and other spaces that want to do community engaged work, it can be difficult for us to be able to understand. And so being able to have this space of sharing and listening, for us to just be able to listen to the stories, there's so much value in that. So I really appreciate that. And I think we all do that. But thank you for sharing your stories. Yes, we will work on sharing, figuring out a way to share the links. I know Lisa shared in the chat a link to the ResearchGate. I'm not sure if all of those links are on there. Omega, are most of the links that you had on that next to the last slide, are they also on the WERA website?
They are on the NIH website.
Okay, okay. They're on the, Lisa, if you could find that on the, while we're chatting, that would be awesome. So what Omega and I met and talked yesterday, and what I would like to do is he and I are gonna, I've got some questions that I would like to ask him before we open it up to the audience for you. So you have a chance to think about what questions you might have for Omega about the work, which I'm certain it's a lot for the work that he's done. But there's a few things that over the years, how many years have you worked with academics? 20 plus years?
Well, I worked longer than that. Of course, I went to graduate school at Bowling Green State University, and I graduated as an undergraduate in 1973 at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. My wife graduated a year after that. And my wife and I were part of the African-American small group that helped integrate the graduate school program at Bowling Green State University. We were recruited specifically to integrate the graduate school program. My wife in education and myself in communication, what was called radio, TV, film, mass communication at that time. That's been a while ago.
Yeah, so you've had a lot of experience on both sides of the table, both as your own educational experiences, and also as a community member, as you shared with us, working to work with university researchers to do this kind of work, and you shared a lot of the challenges that you came up against trying to be an activist and bring change for your community. And one of the big things I wanted to highlight and talk a little bit more about is the importance of this science for corrective action. And myself, I'm a trained biologist, so we're trained to look at things and investigate them and say, I wonder what happens when we do this, or just study things for the sake of studying them, publish those results just like you talked about. But action is not really something that biologists and classical physical scientists and others are trained to do. Throughout my own work and getting to know you and all of the community-based work I've done, I've learned about doing action research and the value of doing that, and always having a need for not just doing research for the sake of research, but doing research for a reason. Can you speak a little bit more to our audience about why it is so important that we make this shift as researchers from doing research for knowledge creation to action?
Well, I'm going to coin a phrase that is really not my own. Is we're going to call it the Fauci approach. You know, Dr. Fauci, the research that he's doing relative to COVID-19, the virus pandemic, all of that research is designed to keep people alive, you know, keep people from dying, and support their health sustainability, not just for today, but for tomorrow. And that's the underlying premise of what we're doing here, the same thing. The tough part about this is the quote unquote equity. When it comes to Black and Indigenous people and Latinx people, and very often women, how that's looked at is looked at as a lesser value. And as a result of that, we see already with the coronavirus, the people who contract and die with the most frequency are those four classes of people. Or quote, you know, the Asian community is included in there too. I mean, that's today, that's the now. And that same thing was, of course, the fact of what we were addressing when we first started doing this work. When residents tell you you can see sewage running in their ditches or in their streets or in their backyards, and it's been there for 30 years, they know it's a health hazard. You know, I mean, that's what people would call common sense. And then you have the public health department come out and look at it, and then they talk to the city to address it. The city refuses to address it. And then when you call federal officers to come down, and they give you us a grant month, a $15,000 grant to study it, but they do absolutely nothing to correct the problem. $50,000 just to find out what's going on, and then they go back to Washington, D.C. The underlying approach of public health is exactly that, to make the public healthier and to correct the problem that's created health disparities, regardless of who they are. The barriers are sometimes just, a lot of people when they see this, this is kind of hard for them to believe that it still happens today. And of course, we always go back to this issue of COVID-19 in this conversation today to show that it's very apparent right now that with all the academicians, Republicans, Democrats, independents, throw all of that out, the barrier between collecting the information and solving a problem, there's a Grand Canyon. I was in the midst of an open argument between major research officials at NIH and EPA several years ago at the Research Triangle Park here in North Carolina, because NIH said we get over $30 billion to research. EPA gets over $7 billion to correct the problem. And they will not change what they do until Congress tells them to, because that's how it's set up. They do the research, EPA solves the problem. Right. And that was an open argument between major officials in front of me when I raised the question about how to address the issue. So they were arguing themselves face to face about who's responsible for the corrective action. So it is structural it is in the structural pattern of how the government works and set up and operates.
Yeah, and so I think it's also partly in the university institutional structures that there are a lot of barriers that we bump up against, and I think there's also some cultural barriers that we bump up against. One of the things you talked about today, you brought up, is the no more Walmart gift cards. I think that may also, some of you may cringe on the inside, but that also goes, I think, to Amazon gift cards and Visa gift cards and other tokenism gift type of things to participants in research. And that is what is sort of expected and what universities approve for us to do as part of our research process. So instead, what would you say to researchers that are like, yeah, okay, I get it, I don't want to do the Walmart gift cards, but what do we do instead?
What you do instead is take a partnership with the community you're working with. And when you're doing these kind of activities like I'm doing, and you have these community groups, whether they finish high school or not, it doesn't matter. If you ask them to lecture to do your classes, you pay them an honorarium. If you are partnering with them with $1 million grant or more, then part of that grant goes directly to that community organization that leads you around the community and shows you everything in order for you to do your research and document whatever it is you're finding. One of the things that we found is groups would come to us after we had some level of visibility in North Carolina and tell us the horror stories. One of the worst ones was a group in Orange County, which is the adjoining county, saying a major professor came to them with bags of cold cheese biscuits as the incentive to ask them to do a $3 million research project on their community that was suffering with water and sewer issues and lack of paved streets, just like we are. And one of those people who came to me was a police officer, a retired police officer. And he was so angry, he was just about to just explode. He couldn't imagine this level of indignity that somebody wanted the community to officially accept that was that's just one. But after traveling in Canada, Toronto, talking to people from the Caribbean, being invited to Vancouver, University of Victoria University in Vancouver. Everybody we've talked to in the country, in the islands, and other countries have found this kind of tokenism. It goes back to what we refer to as a colonial approach. We'll give you, we'll give you a little bit of anything for 50 acres of land. It's the, we know the story from watching the old, as they call them, cowboy and Indian movies. You want to trade 500 buffalo for a piece of silver, something shiny. I mean, it goes back to that, and it's still there. Liam O'Fallon asked me to do 3 different series of lectures with researchers and universities who get federal monies from NIEHS. He was the one that led our review and evaluation before we were on the website with NIH. He wanted me and my wife to talk to university people like we're talking now, face to face before virtual. And we did one of those just a few months before we had the Citizen Science Conference in Raleigh in December 2018. He asked us to meet with hundreds of them because they were promoting the Walmart card. They were actually training other professors at his meeting to use a Walmart card as a gift to people that you use to facilitate $1 million grants. So he asked me to do a presentation. And some of the professors, they did everything but personally attack me for challenging this colonial way. I had already done a presentation at various times at the Research Triangle Park, EPA, NIH, NIEHS, called the Guinea Pig Syndrome. And I also did this presentation at the Citizen Science Association, which talked about this whole process of treating Black and brown communities like guinea pigs. You take them from the little tank and you give them cancer and you put them back in the tank. You take them from the little tank, you test their fecal matter, you put them back in the tank, right? You take them out of the tank, you test their urine, put them back. You test them until they just die. You don't try to cure them. That's not the process of using the guinea pig. You're not trying to cure the guinea pig. You just want to see what can this guinea pig be exposed to before it just is dead one day when you look in the little glass tank you put them in. That's what we were exposed to. So I did that presentation, and I've done it several times, and they wanted me to do it at the Citizen Science Association. Dr. Karen Cooper from North Carolina State University asked me to do it because she'd heard me talk about this. So it's summarized in the context of that particular presentation. It's called the Guinea Pig Syndrome, where major research professors of universities create people of color like guinea pigs. When the guinea pig dies, you go to another community and make them guinea pigs over and over and over and over again.
So the way to address this is, or one of the ways to address this is through community members becoming co-researchers. And there's a tool that I know that WERA has been a leader and worked on creating and evolving over the past many, many years towards addressing things like the guinea pig syndrome of this extractive research process, towards things with equitable payment for research, things around co-authorship that you mentioned in the presentation. I'm sure that all of us have seen or experienced this within university spaces, or maybe even been, as researchers, not been included on papers and work that we've done. Community members, like thinking about the fact that community members should be included on this, access to publications about those communities, all of these things. I know that Omega and his wife Brenda and WERA have created an MOU, so memorandum of understanding, for those that are not familiar with that terminology, around helping to transition and provide some framework for creating these equitable research partnerships. So if you could talk a few minutes about that, and then we'll transition to, we'll open up the floor for some questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, the MOU and MOA,
Yeah.
the Memorandum of Understanding, is an operating relationship. The Memorandum of Agreement is how you proceed with it. That the agreement says, okay, this is what we're going to actually do. They're legal terms. We didn't create the legal term. We didn't create that. We just added, it was like a template, and we added our issue in it. And part of it came from an encouragement we got from the Zephyrus Reynolds Foundation. Some of you who are not in the state may not be aware of Zephyrus Reynolds Foundation is one of the largest foundation funders in the southern part of the United States. The money came from old tobacco money that very much was produced by slave labor. They have over $500 million in assets, in cash assets, and they use the interest to provide grants. And they were one of the organizations that provided grants to us, started back in 1997. And one of the things they told us early on when we were trying to do this collaborative partnership relationship with local universities and local government officials, and they became very aware of the pushback we were getting and the exploitation we were getting. So they said, what you need to do is fire all those people. It's like they said, this is the analogy. If you have 12 disciples and some of them don't want to disciple, and you have 7 after you fire them, you place them with some disciples who want to be disciples, who want to do what you need to do. So I said, okay. So we translated that to the MOU and MOA, that we want you to agree to these things, and we want you to sign off before you start working with us as a community. This is something we share with government officials and university officials. And immediately, people separated themselves, the wheat from the chaff, I think you might say. So there was a certain percentage of who immediately signed on and said, we'll follow your directive based on what you need to survive and thrive, as some people would say. And the other says, I'm not doing it. So the Memorandum of Understanding came out of a very short form that we created based on that suggestion from the Zephyrus Reynolds Foundation, right? And it's grown since then. And of course, now is a lot of people that want to look at it. We've shared it with citizen science community. We've shared it with the University of Concerned Scientists. We've shared it with the American Public Health Association. We've lectured on it at Duke University and other communities, organizations for quite a while now. And because a lot of community groups didn't know that they could do that. Dr. Jacoby Wilson's term is, if you have a professor or person that doesn't do what they need to do, you fire them. As a result of our using this methodology, some of the university professors we used to invite to our annual dinners that we started having in 1995. We uninvited them, and they insisted that we could not uninvite them. So we sent them formal letters and a copy to our pro bono attorney, and the attorney talked to them. Do not come to this dinner. Do not contact the people from the Western Revitalization Association anymore. Do not exploit them anymore. So it became a very formal thing, and you can imagine what their response was. That, you can come to Mebane if you want to, that's your right, but do not contact us, contact our board. And it became a very legal and operative thing that we share with other communities, that they have a right, they have a legal right to be protected and not be interfered with. And that's what the Memorandum of Understanding and Memorandum of Agreement is about. And there's a formal document that part of our information was included in a Memorandum of Environmental Justice that was written for President Obama in 2011. And part of the spirit, as I'm saying, and part of the text was included in that document for the president by an attorney who was working with us as a pro bono attorney, who is now working in the Civil Rights Division at the United States Department of Justice.
Okay, so let's flip. We've got a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat. So okay. I'll hit a couple of those. Feel free to add some questions to the chat. And then also you can raise your hand. There's down at the bottom of if you're on your computer, down at the bottom of the Zoom window, there's reactions. If you click on the reactions, there is a place down at the bottom that says raise hand. And then we will either, like I said, either put them in the chat or use the raise hand function, and we will go through those. So the first one is a question from Sally. It looks like the very first question that I could find in the chat. She wants to know about any comments you have on the Flint water tragedy, and if any of the concepts you've talked about with COMR have been followed in regards to that.
When the Flint water crisis came about, by the way, one of the people that we work with the Citizen Science Association from Michigan, not directly from Flint, is named Vincent Martin. He's one of the people that we work with the Citizen Science Association and have been for years. I was asked to go to Michigan, Detroit, Michigan in August of 2011. And that was during the Obama administration when they had a national environmental justice meeting. And they wanted me to talk about the same issue. I mean, this overall issue of water, sewer contamination, resistance for compliance and enforcement for residents in Michigan, very much like here, except it was very evident in urban areas, right? So they took a different approach because there had been reports in the paper in Michigan. This is not funny, but it just kind of makes me chuckle, the evidence, where the city grows, right? The city grows, becomes urbanized, in some areas that used to be rural is now annexed into the city. And there were stories of people riding their lawnmowers, you know, big, nice yard lawnmowers, and they were falling in the ground. And the stories were wound up in the paper in Detroit. And what was happening is the lawnmowers for old septic tanks. Now the house is connected to the city, and the ride and lawnmowers were heavier than a human being mowing the grass by pushing it, right? Pushing the lawnmower. And they were caving in the tops of the septic tanks and falling in. That's how it made news. And come to find out, you know, that was one of the pieces they asked me to connect to what was going on in Detroit, Michigan. When you go to Flint, Michigan, that issue had its own way of operating. I was asked to be on a call about the Flint, Michigan community, and I was reluctant to say what we were doing in North Carolina. Flint, Michigan already had a legal issue. They already had people who were going to be prosecuted. These are government officials now, state and federal officials. And I didn't feel like it was my place to try to tell somebody didn't know. The EPA asked me to be on the call. I listened, and I did not, you know, try to tell them what to do or what not to do. They were handling it based on what they call contextual science about what was going on there and how it was being handled. And as you may not know, several federal officials for EPA lost their jobs and were prosecuted. There is a list of them who are now being prosecuted who were officials from the state of Michigan, including the former Governor Snyder, for violating rights based on the water crisis because of intentional activities and omission of compliance and enforcement, which is the same thing we were talking about here. They're in court right now, the former governor and several public health officials. If you Google prosecution for Flint, Michigan crisis, Governor Snyder, you will find a whole lot of articles about that. That recently came out just a few weeks ago. So this kind of issue raises the whole question of, can you not be responsible even if you are a government official? And the answer the court is working on right now is yes, you can, because you knew, you evaded, you refused to comply, and you let these poor people suffer, Black, brown, indigenous, etc. And you did it when you knew it was a violation of public health laws, public statutes, and the public officials that work for EPA did not follow suit to corrective action. So they lost their jobs. I don't know how many went to prison, but you know, yeah.
That is going to have some, that's going to be an interesting case to watch, because that's going to have some implications for North Carolina as well, depending on how they end up finding that.
I would think so. There's going to be a lot of research and documentation about what government officials can be held liable for as public health officials, because very often in North Carolina, in Alamance County, in Mebane. You're elected to a job, you're mayor for 10, 15, 20 years, you walk away with all of this, all these problems behind you, and obviously deaths behind you.
Yeah.
People die, you know, and you walk away. And of course, that's a discussion on Capitol Hill now under the impeachment hearing right now that's going on as we speak. It's not the same issue, but it's in the same vein as whether government officials can walk away, public health officials can walk away. And we challenge EPA, Office of Civil Rights, Office of Compliance and Enforcement, that they should be held liable. That's been a part of what we've been doing. And that was part of, we had 4 points of recommendation we sent to the Biden-Harris administration. And the water sewer issue was one, COVID-19 was another. The COMR model was submitted as one that should be addressed and made a formal process of federal government funding for communities to be funded to address these issues. And the other one was contractors. Any money that goes to any federal money that goes to anybody, university contractors down to subcontractors, should be held liable. That was part of the recommendations we submitted to the Harris and Biden administration. Right on target, right exactly with the issue we're dealing with right now, the issue that the Michigan is dealing with right now, to make it law that we be allowed, community groups be allowed to find these government agencies that are paid by taxpayers' money to be liable, including universities.
So Abby had a question about data and data collection. And she asked about gathering data for compliance, that sometimes the regulations that should be there don't exist or are too lenient. What advice do you have for communities in that situation?
You know, that's a herd of elephants right there. One of the things that they asked me as a North Carolinian, as a member of WERA, and as a former advisor for EPA, community advisor for EPA, one of the things they asked me to do is provide suggestions about how to remodel or restructure EPA. I said, what? And also this Council for Environmental Quality. Council for Environmental Quality is a council of all the federal agencies now. It didn't operate under Trump, right? It was operative under President Obama, and it was minimally operative under the Bush administration. But it's supposed to gather all this public health issues and environmental issues and make a report to the president on a regular basis, sits at his elbow. So EPA is only a small part of it, the Council for Environmental Quality. So they asked me and others, including attorneys and some indigenous people, to say, well, hey, what do you think we need to do with these two major branches of government to make them better? Under the Biden-Harris administration, started with the first 100 days. I said, wow, okay, that's pretty interesting. So one of the things that I suggested as a part of our organization is that for compliance and enforcement, it should not be left under the control of the Office of Civil Rights for EPA, because we were one of the groups that filed a complaint against EPA before they selected us to be an advisor for EPA, which was kind of interesting. And they never found our complaint as having any standard, but the Department of Justice did. And the Department of Justice put a moratorium on the highway construction for 16 years, $1 billion interstate highway corridor. So the Department of Justice says you have standing. How can the Office of Civil Rights not do the same thing, right? So part of our, and there were hundreds of these complaints like this, right? And I was on a small team to make recommendations to change that when I was an advisor for EPA. I was on another team when I was not an advisor, after I was quote unquote retired as advisor in 2010. They called me back 3 months later to continue this discussion. And then during the Biden administration, they called me back again. Well, at the beginning in November, they asked me back again to make the recommendation. So I said, well, I told you what I told you. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you again. So I recommended it. That was one of the things that I suggested in the 4 bullet points we submitted. is that the Department of Justice should be the legal arm for addressing compliance and enforcement, not EPA. I got a letter and a couple of emails a few days ago saying that that is going to be included in an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee for the President of the United States. Bam.
Yeah.
They didn't tell me that we're going to do what you suggested, but somebody sent me a copy and said, you might want to read this. And when I read it, I said, wow. So maybe, this input is working. And I got another article from the American Bar Association. They want me to speak on the 26th of this month about how all of these things that we're talking about affects climate and that kind of thing. And mapping, environmental justice mapping of these communities. And they've raised some of the same things, that all of these agencies that are involved must be held liable, made responsible, and communities must have more legal support when they need to force government agencies and industry to comply with existing laws that are already in place. So there's some movement there in the policy writing, and it was also included in a couple of the executive orders that President Biden signed a few days ago. So that's good.
So here's a great question. What kind of resources do you need as a community organization to do this kind of work?
Well, the first thing would be sleep. Right. That'd be for some rest. One thing that we've always struggled with is staff, and you can't have staff unless you have funding, right? So very often people look for relationships with us to do work, and we have to train that person to catch up to where we are, because they assume because we're an environmental group, we're a community group, that they have to show us everything. And it turns out most of the time we know twice as much as they do, sometimes 10 times as much. Very often we get PhDs who come to our community, want to help us right out of school, and they have no idea, what we've done and where we've been and what we've been involved in. And we get attorneys the same way. So I was on a call 2 days ago with the National Wildlife Federation. And by the way, they recognized us nationally. And I sent a picture around to some of you on this call. They recognize our family, the Wilson family, in its work. And one of the things we were talking about is all of the information we're sharing for a second and third generation now, right? Because our sons are in their 40s, right? There has to be compensation for that as consultants or fellows at colleges and universities, and major operating funds for different kind of specific projects, right? That need to take place in our community. Not just this community, but other communities in the state, in the South, and other parts of the country, and outside the country for that matter. And we're presently in a conversation with Wake Forest University and Elon University about exactly how that can be structured, right? That those opportunities to get grant funds for the university, while you're looking at an issue in a community like ours, should be an immediate partnership. So that grant money, when it comes in, we can hire people to operate that part of our activity. So it's a win-win. And it can continue to be a win-win. Smith Reynolds has asked us specifically, you've done this with your sons, they're in their 40s. There's another generation. We want to encourage you to start accepting summer interns to do specific things, like we want you to take this bite, do this bite, and we'll pay for that intern, right? So whatever you come up with, if it's short or long, it should be compensated. This organization and other organizations should be compensated for it. So it's a win-win for the students we're training, a win-win for the professors we're training, and a win-win for the lawyers we're guiding around who holding the law book saying this is illegal, and we're saying this is America. Right? This is North Carolina. This is Alamance County, where people are still kissing a Confederate monument every day. Right? This is real life. This is not the textbook. You're not in Yale Law School anymore. You're out in the world. I mean, Yale is one of the places they invited us to speak. University of North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Duke University. Oh Lord, I mean, the list is going on and on. So that time and energy is precious. And my wife and I were blessed to make it to 71. We won't be here forever. So correctly training that community, those community people who want to follow this path has to be funded. We pay rent, we eat, we repaired our deck, we replaced our water. I'm just talking about this everyday life thing. It costs money. And our offices in our house, we give tours, and now we're giving virtual tours, so setting up that process for whatever you want to work with us on, put a dollar right in front of it. That's the memorandum, MOU, MOA, by the way.
Yeah. So we're not going to have time to get to all the questions, but there is one last question that I think would be a great one for us to end on. And that is from Ashley. And she wants to know, what advice do you have for younger community organizers that are looking to carry forward COMR in their environmental justice communities and often have their agency and lived experiences dismissed by institutions, nonprofits, and government agencies?
This is one of the things where I put the burden on all the professors who own the meeting, the virtual meeting today. Some of the institutional challenges inside. So when you get pushed back as a student, you can't fight it by yourself. You got to find a friendly professor or dean or whomever who's going to fight for you, because sometimes you can get crushed. We had some students in Carolina who had their graduations delayed because they wanted to follow the COMR model, and the university wanted them to follow the CP, the collaborative problem-solving approach. One of those professors, by the way, I'll mention his name, is Dr. Chris Haney. We tried to tell Chris, just go ahead and forget about it. And Chris said, no, it's wrong. The university's wrong. And he stayed a semester and a half. And he had to have a professor who is deceased now. His name is Dr. Steve Wing, to fight for him as a part of it to get his master's thesis process so he can go on and do his doctoral work. And they had to fight because one of the members of his team was so much against recognizing the work he did with us in this issue and all the articles he co-authored with issue. He refused to allow him to pass through. So Dr. Steve Wing came to his aid, and they had to go above, you know how the process goes, if you had to go above in the dean level and have him dismissed from his committee in order for him to graduate. We've had other students who go through similar kinds of things at Duke University who go through similar kinds of things. So you can't do it by yourself if you're a student. You got to find that friendly partner within the university to walk with you. And hopefully you can find somebody in the university who will protect your interests, because they're going to have to protect their interests at the same time. Because if you have an iced-in, an iceberg-in approach at the administrative level, sometimes it's hard, it's tough to make that move, but you want to protect yourself in the process. You don't want to destroy your career fighting a battle you can't handle, but you don't want to dismiss your moral code or ethical code at the same time.
Well, thank you for that. I feel that one more than you know, Omega. I will give a shout out to Lisa. Has been that person for me, helping me do this work on the university institutional side, which is why I get the privilege of being able to support you here today as part of this conversation. So thank you for letting me be here today. Thank you for sharing your words today. Gordon, I'm going to turn it back to you if there's anything that you want to add, ask, wrap up with.
So I think we should leave it with Ashley's question, because in a way it's one of the most important ones today, right? How do we continue this process? And I love the answer, right? That it requires partners and support. So I've just been very pleased to be able to host this conversation. and be a part of that process. I noticed that Max Liboiron came up in the chat, and again, I dumped the Zoom registration link into the chat, so you can even bypass the web page if you want to see her. So mainly, I just want to thank everyone for coming and invite you to continue to be a part of this series and other Ethics Center events. And thank you finally to Omega and to Angel.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate everyone.